What's up, everyone? Welcome to ClearTalk. So, in this video, I'm finally getting to the end of the Jesus series. All right. Here in this video, this is probably going to be a long video. I'm just going to go ahead and warn you. All right. It could be very much long. I would be surprised if I can keep it under an hour. So what we're going to do here is we're going to try to finish out everything that we have left. Because the last time we were talking about his ministry, and so now we have the end. We have we're going to go over the two trials, the being arrested, the Sanhedrin trials, which is the Jewish council. We're going to talk about the Pilate trials, and then we're going to then go into the crucifixion, and the death and burial, the resurrection, and go through all of that, and that's all like the inside biblical part. Then we'll talk about outside, the Gospels for as far as biblical, and then we're going to talk about what anything that was stated outside the Gospels that was still biblical, and then we're going to talk about non-biblical sources, real briefly, and then kind of the idea, behind what historians consider the trial, crucifixion, resurrection, all that. What is more in a historical view, and then I'm just going to give my personal view. So. Thank you very much for joining me here. If you like what you see here, like what you hear here, if you want to check out more videos from the channel, please do so. From ClearTalk, consider subscribing, like, share, comment, all that good stuff. And if you'd like to check out videos from my other channels, JMDPLAY, puzzling, that would be amazing as well. Consider subscribing to those. Any support you give, any help you can give in there, getting more videos in front of, more eyes, helping out the algorithm and all that, that would be great. If you want to give any kind of support, there are links there for support, whether it's ongoing support at Patreon, $3 a month there, or if you want to do like a one-time donation, any kind of support you give and want to join the JMD Nation, that would be amazing. And I'll thank you very, very much. And if you're returning, you're freaking awesome. Thank you. Welcome back to ClearTalk. Keep coming back. Okay, so I want to really quickly recap. All right, so we've talked about the birth. We talked about his young childhood. We talked about his teachings, baptism and teachings, and now we are here at the end. What we've previously established is that, the differences, the nuances between the four Gospels, okay? Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Seemingly that the author of Mark seemed to... His whole perspective was seeming that everything around Jesus was a mystery, right? Everything about it was a mystery. Nobody really understood. Nobody really knew what was going on. It wasn't realized till after the fact, kind of thing. So yeah, Mark, it's a mystery. Matthew seems to be his audience. He seems to be placating to an audience that feels more Jewish in nature, so he is concentrating on fulfillment of prophecy, from Jewish prophecy, from the Old Testament. That seems to be his core thing, trying to emphasize that in his writing, and he seems to be taking from Mark for the most part. As we also established, Mark is well understood or known to be the earliest of the Gospels, and then Matthew and Luke kind of, take from Mark, but also potentially take from their own source, and then potentially a collective source, or sources, the Q document sources or whatever, that, is sort of theoretical, but to some sense very much makes sense, and we've talked about that in other videos. Luke seems to be talking more to a non-Jewish audience, and it seems to concentrate more on Jesus being compassionate and forgiving and stuff like that, and like the idea is that Jesus wasn't just for the Jews; he was for everybody, like Gentiles, Jews, everybody alike. That's kind of Luke's niche there in his writing or her writing, whoever wrote Luke. And then John, we know, is the one. Whoever wrote John seemed very much, which is thought to be later, seemed very much emphasizing his divinity. Very much the more theological book, trying to establish a more theological, religious-like idea, facing Jesus as God. From here at the beginning to the end, the Alpha Omega, like he's very much, that's how his writings tend to portray him. So, all right, we're going to start with sort of the idea here, the historical context of this time, okay, to understand crucifixion and why, what was going, what was going on in this, why it was used. And you just have to understand Jerusalem and the Roman Empire in this era. This is the week of Passover, which is a time where tens of thousands of Jewish pilgrims crowd into the city to celebrate their freedom from Egypt, being freed from Egypt. This is the idea where they celebrating coming in. Their freedoms or whatnot, to the extent that they have freedoms. To Rome, the public order is very important. They are ruling over this area, as they, the empire was large, ruled over a lot of areas. But the idea for them was, public order, maintaining that order through the most vicious means necessary, if that's the case. So that was everything to them. Roman soldiers were on high alert because big crowds and the religious tensions there often caused troubles. Crucifixion was Rome's way of sending a message. It wasn't just an execution. It was supposed to be humiliating. Victims were stripped, they were beaten, and displayed publicly, at their most vulnerable, weakest, like to the death, as a warning. Like, do not cross us or this could happen to you. It was typically reserved for rebels, insurrectionists, and slaves, and not Roman citizens. So, the idea that somebody like Jesus would be crucified does kind of fit in the idea of Roman practice, no doubt. The one thing that I would quickly stress here right off the bat is that I grew up in the idea that Jesus was like the only one that was ever done this way. And that's kind of, and that was kind of seemed like it was stressed to some degree. Like, Jesus underwent the most gruesome, painful death ever imagined, and nobody else has ever, felt that. Nobody else has, experienced that. And coming to find that alone was not true was very eye-opening for me just in itself, when it come to what I was told and what I was taught growing up, by, my religious leaders and whatnot. There's that to me is very interesting, understanding that this was widely practiced. Thousands, tens of thousands. There's no telling how many people were killed, died to crucifixion by the Roman Empire. And there are other deaths that are just as bad, if not worse, than even crucifixion that has happened in history. Jesus is not unique in that. So I just want to go ahead and get that out of the way, and have that understood. He was one of many, many, that was dealt a violent death, so to speak. So when we have the arrest, all right, we're going to start with the arrest and the Sanhedrin trial. The arrest is where, before dawn, Jesus was seized in the Garden of Gethsemane. All the followers fled, and he was basically left alone. And this was because he was given up by, of course, Judas. All the Gospels pretty much agree with that. They agree with the arrest and all that. And the only real differences in them is like the purpose, or the takeaway kind of Judas portraying Jesus. Again, Mark in the Mark focuses mostly on the act of Judas actually portraying Jesus. That's where he concentrates the most of. There, all of them's when it comes to the Sanhedrin trial, which is the Jewish council. These trials were like Jewish religious authorities that determined Jesus's validated Mosaic law. It's concerned with like blasphemy and stuff. So if they, and treat perceived threats to religious authority. So when you had these accusations, and there were false accusations. Of course, that's what the books state, is that there were false witnesses against him, false testimonies that didn't really fully line up. But it's because the idea of all of them is the innocence of Jesus. And so these were trials, a council that's basically trying to see the arguments of blasphemy or some sort of religious threat to authority or something, and Jesus was considered that by certain groups of the people of the public and certain parts of this council. Mark, like I said, he concentrates mostly on on Judas actually committing the betrayal, and then states that it's basically that Jesus remained mostly silent in the questioning. Like Mark 14:61, but he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" So he doesn't speak much, stays silent, stays calm. But like I said, everything's wrapped in mystery here. Nobody understands what's going on really, because these procedures also were like done hastily in the middle of the night, which is seemingly like very possible that was like against procedural norms. So all of this is very like it was secretive. So it is all kind of odd. Again, Matthew and Luke kind of take a little bit from Mark, but then kind of in their different ways. Matthew explores more of the high priests and elders who were in on the betrayal of Judas, and basically that they were somewhat come across as a plot, like they were plotting against arresting Jesus and using Judas to do so. In Matthew 26:14-15, then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" He was paid 30 pieces of silver, and later feels remorse, returning the money and saying, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood," which is Matthew 27:4. So Matthew is kind of giving this idea that Judas was originally greedy. He was betraying because of greed, wanting payment, seeing the benefit of that, but then tragically becomes aware that he is his consequences have actions, and he was felt remorse and gave the money back. And this Jesus Still, again, stays mostly quiet, but still affirms that he is the Messiah, fulfilling prophecy. Okay, we know Matthew wants to be obsessed with prophecy. So in Matthew 26, 36 through 64, again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" To which Jesus replied, "You have said so." So it's kind of like he's not necessarily agreeing, but he's also not disagreeing. You've said so, I am. But, so this is all around fulfilling prophecy. Luke kind of brings Judas, explains Judas's betrayal to be more of a cosmic thing, more of a spiritual thing. When Judas adds a spiritual dimension, he says in Luke 22, 3 through 4, then Satan entered into Judas, who was one of the 12. He went away and discussed with the chief priests how he might betray him. So here, Luke is stating that it was part of like this spiritual cosmic struggle, that it wasn't a personal choice, that Judas wasn't doing this out of greed. He wasn't doing it for any kind of personal reasons. It was Satan. It was a spiritual thing, something that took him over, that caused him to betray Jesus. Jesus remains calm and foreknowledged. He challenges false accusations, and the trial kind of highlights his innocence. This one has done nothing to deserve death. That's Luke 23:41. Again, Luke is trying to create this spiritual dimension around Judas. So he's not necessarily blaming Judas for Judas's act, and trying to make sure that Jesus stays calm and he is innocent. Making sure that his innocence is known. John frames Judas's betrayal that is kind of intertwined with Jesus. Like Jesus has full knowledge of Judas's betrayal, and is expecting it, and basically even, you could even argue, was accepting of it. During the Last Supper, Jesus identifies Judas. John 13:26 through 27. He dipped a piece of bread and gave it to Judas, and after he took the bread, Satan entered into him. So John's emphasizing here that both the foreknowledge of Jesus and the spiritual corruption. So John is kind of, again, stating that Satan, entered into him, but also this acknowledgement that Jesus knew about it, that it was all a part of the design, and it was all a part of, this grand scheme, this grand design from beginning to end. It was always known to be going to happen, and, or whatever. And also he focuses, there's a dialogue between the high priest Annas and then Caiaphas, whatever. It emphasizes his divine identity and the political religious tension. Jesus answers in John 18:20 through 21, "I have said openly that I am, and I continue to say it." So it's like this whole thing again. When Jesus knows what's happening, he expects it. He's a part of the plan. He's instated who he was. I am who I am. There's no confusion. Everybody understands it. Which comes with the idea that John was later. So at this point, everybody does know it, or they assume everybody knew, or those that were in the Johannine group of followers and believers. That was how they accepted and took it, was that, this was always a part of this grand plan. Jesus was, again, beginning and the end. So again, to sort of recap those trials, the trials were secretive, quick, largely internal. They emphasized prophecy, teaching, and spiritual authority. intended as a legal procedure within Jewish law, and they were conducted hastily and at night, which was, again, probably outside of the norm. So this is which originated with Mark and his mystery here. But they did not have any kind of authority to execute him. That was Romans who had to carry out execution. So that's the reason why he was brought to Pilate. So now we have the trial before Pilate. The purpose here was, is conducted by Pontius Pilate. He was the Roman governor, and it was to address the charges against Jesus under Roman law. So concerning with the sedition, claiming to be king of the Jews, which you understand for the Romans. Now, king of the Jews for the Jews themselves would be like, it could be considered blasphemy. It can be considered, a challenge to the Jewish authorities, priests and stuff and whatnot. So, that could be a challenge for them and would, like I said, be considered blasphemy. But for Romans, though, the king of the Jews is more an actual, power thing as a whole, because the Romans didn't want any insurrections or argue against their rule. So the idea of him saying that he's the king of the Jews meant that he's challenging the Roman king as being the ruler of these people ultimately. And so that is a political threat for Roman authority. Now, as far as Pilate's concerned, I come across as a little odd on Pilate, because it seems like some resources state Pilate as a violent and vicious governor. Like he was basically a one of the hardcores that you can think of. But then others kind of state him as a little bit more like he was just seemingly kind of down the middle. He ruled by law. It generally stuck to Roman procedures, and but wasn't really that vicious. So I don't really know the true, to speak, Pilate. Who knows what he was really like. But again, in Mark and Matthew, Luke, John, there are slight. They're most Matthew, Mark, and Luke, again, kind of the synoptics, they kind of follow one another for the most part. There's some slight changes. John, I think, is again the sort of outlier a little bit here, and just the idea or the putting in a struggle there that seems more of a even bigger threat to Roman authority. So with Mark, Pilate finds no guilt in Jesus, but the crowd demands crucifixion. So Jesus remains largely passive, just like he did with the Sanhedrin trials, not saying a whole lot. And Mark focuses mostly on the legal procedure. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "You say so." Kind of a very similar answer that he gave in the Sanhedrin trial. You say I am, so, I don't, what it's a mystery. Am I? I don't know. Mark 15:2. Matthew, Pilate attempts to release Jesus, offers the crowd the choice to free Barabbas, and then kind of washes his hands of the whole situation. So when Pilate said that he was getting nowhere, but that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood." That's Matthew 27:24. So Matthew is, again, not putting much blame on Pilate. He's just like, Pilate is washing his hands of it. I'm completely innocent here. Y'all are the ones that want him dead. I have nothing to do with it. So, which is, again, that whole idea is a little odd, that a ruler like this would just completely fall over to the whims of, especially if he's a vicious ruler like some have stated, that he would not just kind of wash his hands and be like, or even fall to the whims of the Jews and in this Jewish crowd. I mean, it would have seemed like he would have more, especially if he found them innocent, if the Jewish crowd and stuff were creating riots, it feels like to me he would be more prone to concern himself with that than trying to crucify Jesus. But I mean, whatever. In Luke, emphasizes Pilate's recognition of Jesus' innocence and again repeated attempts to release him. But they were insistent, demanding the loud voices that he be crucified. So Pilate gave his verdict and that their demand should be granted. Luke 23:23 through 24. So, again, in Luke, all three of the synoptics, it's basically, Pilate did not find any guilt in Jesus. The crowd was demanding it. So this is the one part where it feels like even Matthew, even though he's seemingly, for the most part, speaking to a Jewish crowd, he does seem to just fall to the idea that the Jewish crowd is the ones that's, asking for this. So this is the one spot I feel like where Matthew kind of does go against. But it's all a part of this pre-existing philosophy, prophecy anyways. So it was all going to happen anyways. And I guess that's where you can, if you're strong manning the writer there, that, you would think that he would have felt more prone to find some sort of defense of the Jewish people, but instead, because of it being prophecy, I guess he's just like, it was supposed to be this way, so it didn't matter. I don't know. With John, the writer here, he's kind of creating this sort of kingly face off to some degree. It's a small degree, but nevertheless, focus on theological dialogue and including Jesus' kingship and Pilate's struggle with the meaning of truth, where Jesus states to him, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Meaning, like, so that's almost like you would not be able to touch me. I am more important than you, and that you would not even have the ability to trial me or crucify me or make any kind of action with me if it wasn't given to you from a higher power than even me, meaning God. That God gives him the power because of this grand plan for him to allow him to be crucified, and that's the only reason why he has any power over Jesus in that moment. So basically, he's sacrificing and foregoing his kingly power to Pilate for Pilate to be allowed to carry out these actions. So it's a bit of a like, look, man, the only reason why I'm even, you even getting away with this is because big guy up there, he's letting you. And I am letting you. Otherwise, we could stomp you right now. Like, it's just that kind of, it's a weird kind of weird thing. And very much completely different from the other three. Again, this is where John pushes off from the Synoptics in stating that sort of divinity, that power, that the bigger plan in place kind of thing. All right. Now we move on to the crucifixion. So, Mark, uh, Mark being the earliest gospel, Mark emphasizes the human suffering of Jesus, and that Jesus is like seemingly abandoned. Uh, States that Jesus was crucified at 9 a.m., and that is also across Matthew and Luke. John is the one that deviates from that. John states that he was basically crucified at noon. But that's probably John's confusion of the time and the events, and where he's placing, and also John's wanting to really concentrate it around the Passover sacrifice of the Passover lambs. And Mark, he's mocked by stand-byers. Darkness covers the land, and his words are a cry of anguish. Mark 15:24-33. And they crucified him. And when the 6th hour had came, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. And and Jesus cries out, echoing the ancient Psalms, my God, why have you forsaken me? So it feels anguished. It feels questionable. It feels mysterious, like Jesus doesn't even understand, or isn't quite completely. It's certainly not a plan. It's certainly not that he's in the loop. He doesn't completely even feel like he completely understands why he's being crucified. He knows it's a part, like he knows that it's what's gotta be, but he doesn't really know why. He's kind of just somewhat accepting it, but also questioning, why have you forsaken me? I have, been a loyal, and taught your word. I've been loyal to you. I've been a good person. Why are you forsaking me? Mark is raw, simple, and tragic. The tone of a witness overwhelmed by what they've seen. And Matthew keeps most of Mark's structure, but adds some sort of earthly, dramatic, dramatism to it. Earthquakes, temple veil, even tombs breaking open and the dead rising. In Matthew 27:51-52, the earth shook, the rocks were split, and the tombs were opened. This version emphasizes Jesus as the Messiah who fulfills prophecy. And that this is just not any kind of ordinary death. In Luke, Jesus shows mercy even in death. So Jesus is calm and forgiving. In Luke 23:34, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And then he comforts the thief. Luke 23:43, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. So he's comforting others on the way to the cross, promising paradise to a thief, and his final words, which differ from Mark and Matthew. Mark and Matthew both say, my God, how have you forsaken me? In Luke, he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Whoa, that's a difference. That's a change. Luke portrays Jesus as innocent and in control, embodying forgiveness even in death. So it's like Jesus is not confused. He knows what's happening. He's forgiving everybody around him for the events that are happening because they do not know what they're doing. They don't understand that this is supposed to happen. And then to your hands I commit my spirit. So, wow, that's interesting. That's a big difference there for Luke. And one way that he deviates finally from Mark and Matthew in a big way. John's version is the most theological and frames around purpose and divine. Here, Jesus carries his own cross in John. The time of his death coincides with the sacrifice of the passing of the lambs, which is at noon. In John 19:17, carrying his own cross, he went out into the place of the skulls. In John 19:30, and his final words of triumph was, "It is finished." Okay. Jesus isn't showing defeat, he's showing completion. Jesus finishes the divine plan that began in the beginning. So if you go to John, it states in the very first of John, in the beginning, and to the end, it is finished. So there's this great plan, Alpha, Omega, the beginning, the end. He has carried out this plan, and in this moment, it is triumph, and his last words were, "It is finished." So do you have a huge difference in the last words amongst the four Gospels from, "Oh my God, how have you forsaken me?" which is also repeated by Matthew, from Mark. This, misunderstanding or this not confusion on what's going on, or on Jesus's part. But then Luke kind of plays in, no, actually Jesus kind of knew what was going on, and he's forgiving everybody there. Like it's, he's giving forgiveness to everybody, and he's committing himself to the Lord in this act of forgiveness, of repent, for everybody. And then John, of course, it's a whole different story. Carrying his own cross and making it a completion to the beginning. I'm losing my place. I have a whole bunch of notes here I'm trying to go through. So once again, Mark focuses on suffering. Matthew is highlighting Hebrew prophecy, earthquakes, resurrected saints, symbolizing divine confirmation. Luke emphasizes compassion, portrays Jesus as innocent and merciful, forgiving his executioners. John emphasizes Jesus' divinity. He chooses the moment of his death and fulfills his mission with control. So yeah, that's the crucifixion. Now we move on to death and burial. All four Gospels agree Jesus died by crucifixion and is buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council. After the crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus' body and laid it in a tomb. Mark 15:46, he wrapped him in a clean linen cloth and laid him in a tomb that had been hewn out of rock, or hewn out of rock, whatever. The only big difference is John adds that Nicodemus helps and brings spices, about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes in John 19:39. So that's the only major difference there, is that in John he adds in Nicodemus helping him out and bringing spices to anoint the body and whatnot. This burial detail is significant, the whole detail of Joseph, because Roman crucifixions usually did not allow for proper burials. Usually the bodies were left on the cross to just rot, and then eventually dumped in mass graves. But Jesus is given a proper burial according to the Gospels. And for a long time that was a big question there. but archaeologists have found some other bodies that have been found that were crucified, but were found in a proper burial space. So it's not like outside the realm of an action. It was just extremely rare. And, for it to even be written that way, it must have been known that was something that could happen. Because if it was something that most certainly never happened, more than likely they wouldn't have written it. I wouldn't see them just completely making up in that, making that up. So, all right. That's the death and burial. Now, resurrection. Now comes the most debated part. All four Gospels agree that the tomb was found empty. But after that, each story diverts very differently. Mark, women arrive first and discover the tomb is empty. And I think even like Mary Magdalene was a part of the group. They see a young man in white robe who tells them Jesus is risen. Mark 16:6, you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. And then the women flee and tell no one. That's it. The original Mark is widely thought to have ended right there. There are other editions of Mark that add in a extra bit of that add in appearances and stuff like that. But scholars have pretty much identified those as later editions because they're written. The style of writing is very much different from the rest of Mark. So it's thought that these later versions that had these appearances and stuff was not originally a part of Mark. The original part of Mark abruptly ended right there, leaving no appearances, no triumphant finale, nothing. The women just flee and told no one, which in itself is weird because if they told no one, then how did the writer of Mark know about it and write it? Which is probably the reason why later on early Christian scribes and stuff added in appearances and stuff to make Mark sound and sort of flow with the other Gospels. It would make more sense. But Mark didn't write that way. Mark just ended it there, and that was it. No like appearance, no nothing. He's risen, he's disappeared, there's nobody here. It's full on grasp of the mystery that Mark is, that Jesus is in Mark. Matthew expands on the story. Again, there's earthquakes. An angel rolls back the stone. The guards faint, and Jesus appears. Matthew 28:10, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. And then later, Matthew records the final commission. Matthew 28:19, go and make disciples of all nations. So, here we have, appearances even of Jesus in the tomb. And then later, he meets, with disciples and whatnot, and, tells them all, to go spread the word, and then he makes his ascension. Luke's resurrection is centered in Jerusalem, which is a little different, and emphasizes recognition and understanding. The women find the tomb empty, and the angel explains. Luke 24:5-6. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. And then there's the story of Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Two disciples meet Jesus, but do not recognize him until he breaks bread with the disciples later on to prove that he is not a ghost. Grounding the story in tangible reality. In Luke 24:31, their eyes were open and they recognized him. So Jesus is not there in the tomb in Luke, even though he was in Matthew. He wasn't in Mark. He's risen, and on the road to Emmaus, two disciples meet him, but they don't recognize him. And it's not until when he meets up with all the disciples later and breaks bread with them to prove that he's not a ghost, because they don't believe him. They don't believe he's Jesus. So he must eat to prove that he's a livable, tangible thing, and based in reality, which is kind of a weird thing. Like you would think that there would be quicker ways, better ways to believe somebody is real and not a ghost outside of eating. I mean, but whatever. Their eyes were open and they recognized him. So they could not recognize him. He did not look or appear the same to them until he ate and broke bread with them. And then all of a sudden their eyes were opened. Feels like a kind of breaking the bread, the Passover, the Last Supper kind of feel. When they, ate the bread, this is of his blood. Well, it kind of get that feeling. It's kind of a sort of a callback to some degree, I feel like, there in Luke. Now in John, John tells a little more of a deeply personal story. Mary Magdalene is the first witness. She mistakes Jesus as a gardener in the garden until he says her name. Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him. John 15. Then he calls her name, by name, Mary, in 16. She recognizes him immediately. So, even at first in John, Mary doesn't recognize him. Mary is supposed to also be like one of the most important, one of the most influential, one of the most connected, especially among the women, to Jesus. Yet she doesn't recognize him at first. And it's not until he calls her name that he recognizes her. And then later we have the Doubting Thomas story, in which is completely unique to John, where he appears to the disciples, but Thomas is not with them. And then the disciples meet with Thomas. Thomas does not believe them and says, he will not believe him until he sees and touches him. And then, of course, Jesus comes to him. Thomas touches his wounds, and all of a sudden, boom, he believes. That's the Doubting Thomas story. And that was, like I said, solely unique to John and not in any of the others. So yes, Mark ends abruptly, emphasizing fear, awe, and mystery. Matthew shows triumph and mission, go and make disciples. Luke highlights faith through witness. And John is the most personal and spiritual account, focusing on personal revelation and belief. Where, Thomas didn't believe until he saw, he touched, he felt. And that's your resurrection. And that's the biblical count. And I'm at 50 minutes. Where was any of this spoken outside the Gospels in the Bible? The one account is in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, which would be considered the earliest writing because it is one of Paul's writings. So this arguably is before even the Gospels. The empty tomb story is early and likely pre-gospel tradition. In 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, Christ died from our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried, he was raised on the third day, and he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. So here, Paul, which is considered the earliest, technically, says that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. So this, even he's stating, which makes it weird that Mark doesn't say anything, unless Mark just assumes that the reader would know what happened after that. But yet he states that the women do not say anything, that they flee and tell no one. Luke, he has to, be the 12 don't even believe he's real. They think he's a ghost until he eats. Matthew. Well, anyways. So we get that outside of the Gospels. That's the only take really outside of the Gospels in the Bible. Now we have non-biblical sources. You have Roman historical sources, which is Tacitus in the Annuals 1544. This is around 115 CE. Mentions Christus executed under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. Describes Christianity as a pernicious superstition that spreads rapidly. Now, this is not, this is Roman historical sources. They don't, there's not Christian sources. They do not, they're not a part of the Christian movement. Confirms the crucifixion historically. You have Suetonius, Life of Claudius, 25:4, mentions disturbances among Jews in Rome at the instigation of Christus, probably referring to disputes over Jesus' messianic claims. Then you have Pliny the Younger, letter to Trajan, which is around 112 CE, describes Christians singing hymns to Christ as to a god. Indicates worship of divine resurrected figure within a generation of Jesus. So there we have non-biblical sources that are basically stating, yes, there was this person that was crucified by Pontius Pilate that is known as Christus, Christ, which this is years after, okay, a whole generation or two after the fact. So that will be the stories that are going around. They will be from the early Christian movement, and so at that point they would have been calling him Christ. So that makes sense there. But so that's still just, for me, this is still just stories. Jewish sources, Josephus, which should be around 93 CE in the Antiquities, mentions Jesus as a wise man crucified under Pilate. A later Christian interpolation adds that he was the Christ. So something added later saying that he was the Christ. Most scholars believe Josephus' original writing was neutral and did not make that last modification. Nonetheless, confirms Jesus' existence and execution. And then you have the Talmud. The Sanhedrin 43a mentions a Yeshu who was hanged on the eve of Passover for sorcery and leading Israel astray. Wow, that's interesting. So this is from a Jewish source material. Hanged in Jewish idiom, including crucifixion. Hostile source, yet aligns with timing and method of death. So this is someone who's, again, hostile to the Christians, to Jesus, but asserting that he was hung for sorcery and leading Israel astray. So there you go. You also have gospels that are outside the Bible. The Gospel of Peter, Thomas, Mary, and James, that don't really necessarily speak on specifics of uh, the crucifixion or the resurrection, but Gospel of Peter, which is a second century text, adds spectacular resurrection imagery. It's the only one I think that necessarily does kind of talk about a resurrection, saying a talking cross and giant angels, adding that type of imagery. Gospel of Thomas, which is mostly a sayings text, so there's nothing that's direct to a death or resurrection narrative or anything like that. This is a sayings gospel. It focuses on Jesus' sayings and inner knowledge rather than his death. It emphasizes that the kingdom is realized through personal insight. So Thomas 3 says the kingdom is inside of you and is outside of you. When you know yourself, then you will be known. Gospel of Mary. This is a fragmented Coptic text from the 2nd century. Mary provides guidance to the disciples after the resurrection. She emphasizes personal vision and understanding of Jesus' message, but there is this battle between control or like authority given there between Peter and Mary, where Peter kind of questions her authority. Jesus says to Mary, "Sister, you know that the Savior loved you more than the rest of women. Tell us the words of the Savior which you remember, which you know, but we do not, nor have we heard them." So it's almost this sort of sarcastic way of saying, "Oh, you were the most loved. Tell us words." He supposedly give you words of wisdom and stuff that he did not speak to us. He only spoke to you. So what are these words? It's kind of that kind of thing. When Peter questions her authority, she responds with clarity and engagement, showing that insight and spiritual understanding were not confined to male leaders. And then the Gospel of Judas, which was discovered in the 1970s. This presents Judas in a different way, as not a betrayer in a negative sense, but an obedient disciple acting according to Jesus' instructions. Okay, Jesus tells Judas that he will sacrifice the man that clothes me, referring to his physical body. Judas' act is portrayed as necessary for Jesus to transcend the material world, aligning with Gnostic belief. You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. The text frames the crucifixion as a cosmic act, less about punishment and more about spiritual liberation. So Judas, the Gospel of Judas, sort of flips that whole idea of Judas actually being a betrayer. Like, he's portraying him, yes, but it's because Jesus has instructed him to. Which, kind of almost flows with John in a weird way. Because, in John, Jesus knows, it's a part of the plan. And he even sort of like breaks, to some degree, acknowledges that in the book of John. So this, even though this is considered heretic and a Gnostic. All of these are considered Gnostic. You could see where a sector of Christianity could take that way, especially if they're more from the Johannine like line or whatever of belief. Possibly. So, now, historian consensus. Finally, Jesus was almost certainly crucified, one of the best attested facts of antiquity. The resurrection is considered a theological rather than a historical claim, but historians note that early disciples certainly believed Jesus appeared to them. The early Christian movement began almost immediately after his death, and the transformation of disciples and willingness to die for their faith is cited as indirect evidence of conviction. The crucifixion was brutal. Jesus suffered humiliation, physical agony, and death. Yet in the Gospels, the narrative also emphasizes meaning, fulfillment, fulfillment of prophecy, forgiveness, and divine purpose. I'm sorry. I'm talking too much. Proof to you that I do not cut things most of the time, anyways. Yeah. So it's the historians' account that yes, from them, and scholars alike, pretty much have come to the agreement that Jesus certainly lived, and there was very good evidence that he was crucified. But when it comes to the resurrection, that's more of a theological, spiritual claim that really can't be proved or disproved, arguably. But it is clear, at least by the Gospels, and even non-biblical Gospels, that Jesus appeared, and they believe that they saw him. Now, to what degree of any of that is based in actual reality, or more of a like post-mortem kind of grievance, delusion or illusion or whatever, seeing things, people you have lots of people that claim all the time that they've seen their dead relatives or whatever after the fact, ghostly like or whatever. And even to the degree of trying to bring reality to it, like bringing them in tangibly, just like Luke did. So to what degree that, and for storytelling, it would make, it would fit perfectly. That, he rose again, he spoke, he was proved to be alive, and that he rose and is real, and, which makes the story even greater, before rising and going to the right hand of God or whatever, rising into the heavens. For me, okay, we're at the hour mark. I'm gonna get close to. I said I was gonna try to keep it under an hour. Here's what I think, and about this whole story. And I've said it before. I do think that there was a Jesus, a man named Jesus, a man that, of all historical sense, probably existed. Most likely it existed. Struggled, through all the struggles of anybody else in that time, childhood, whatnot. He may have, played around with, even to an extent that you believe he was divine, or that he it was a miracle worker, rather, that he did magic or something, or delve into that. Okay, I mean, everybody, there's a lot of people from that time that played in quote unquote magic, that could do miraculous things, or at least stories are told. But I believe he was a man that probably was influenced by someone like John the Baptist I spoke before. Thought that there was end times were near, was emboldened in the idea of Israel becoming, or that the Jewish people would gain their own independence and freedom, like full freedom, even from the Roman Empire. The whole apocalyptic view. I think he was a part of that. To some degree, he potentially was even a rebel of sense. Someone who went against the authorities, at least in a verbal sense, or, and trying to turn people from authorities, maybe to some degree. But I believe I believe he became a problem. I believe he became a problem from the Jewish concern that, or even from the like Jewish elites, that he was, maybe potentially going against their direction, pathway, because he was trying to bring about more of the old school Jewish ideas in his teachings that, wasn't playing so much in probably the modern idea of Judaism at that time, or where they wanted it to go. So he was a threat to the Jewish elites, more than likely. He became a threat to the Roman elites because of the claims, not even necessarily by him, but by others, more than likely. I'm sure he had a following. It was probably very small, but I'm sure he had a following that put him a little bit up on a pedestal, a fan base, you could argue, that made claims, of one of which could have been very much the King of Jews, or the possibility that his opposition created that argument, maybe the elders and stuff of the Jewish council and whatnot, created that, placed that on him, because they knew that that would be enough to push the Roman authorities to potentially crucify him or get rid of him in whatever way. I'm not so certain on the like Pilate being so innocent or being or taking, so much credence to the Jewish witnesses and those that were trying to, the crowd that was building up, or the potential riot argument. I'm not so sure that he would have taken so much to that. It feels to me a little I don't know, a little much. I think that's part of that was sort of fabricated or just imagined, created to not necessarily blame the Romans or anything, and that this was more of an inter-Jewish issue. That was trying to, I don't know, bring about a new revelation for the Israelites, or for the Jews, trying to spread their, maybe this overarching, like, spread the idea further than just Judaism or whatever, and for more people. I don't know what like idea behind that, but I think a real guy definitely, certainly was probably, this person, was more than likely found to be guilty of potential riots, or potentially creating a issue where the Roman emperors or elites, the Roman army, the Roman powers would want to go ahead and squash before it got too big. So they decided, you know what, these people want them killed. We also would not be frowned or be, unhappy if he disappeared too. So whatever, let's crucify him. Go ahead. I do believe he was crucified, more or less. The beating and all that stuff more than likely happened, because it happened pretty much with every one of the crucifixions. And all the extra, earthquakes, the temple veil, and all this kind of stuff, I think that's all just storytelling. I think he just died, more than likely not knowing what he was really dying for, potentially, or maybe he did. I feel like Mark's version was probably closer to some degree on what actually happened, the feeling to some degree of what actually was being felt. Although at the same time, I kind of also feel that Mark may have been straight up creating a story. Like, Mark could have potentially been just flat out, like every bit of Mark could be false, or a majority of it anyways, with like some true stuff thrown in here and there to make it legitimate, but it could be completely false. I mean, and then you had Luke and Matthew, playing off of it, which I think I've talked about this before. There's an argument there, I think, that can be, questioned. But yes, I do think that there was a man. He was probably crucified. And, maybe because of the idea that he probably was innocent. I don't know. Or maybe connections that his mother had, or Mary Magdalene herself, since she was potentially even royalty herself, had connections to have him pulled from the cross and given a proper burial, to which he was probably buried. It's possible that thieves, because there's a rumor that his body could have been stolen. There is, that was something that happened in that time, apparently, by other sources, that bodies were, stolen a lot, thieves and stuff. It's possible. I don't know. Maybe that's why that there were. You could argue that could be why people wrote or found that his body wasn't there and he couldn't be found. But no, I do not believe in the resurrection. I do not believe that he rose 3 days later. Or ascended to heaven. That whole thing, I think, is completely theological and created by early Christian actors to make this a grander story than it was, to create that Christ-like figure, and create a movement to push his, or what they thought his ideas were, at least. Because if he was as mysterious as Mark makes him out, then, I mean, and like confused, even the disciples confused and not really understanding his teachings, you have to question even those who wrote about him, as, how did they really even truly understand him? And did they really represent him properly? Even if you do believe all that. But yeah, that's pretty much my opinion and idea behind that. I do think it's an interesting stories, or there, and as we there's certainly clear differences in many ways between the four gospels, depending upon who they're writing for and their purpose for writing. Like their purpose for Jesus and what they wanted him to be remembered as or remembered for. And the problem with modern take on this is that they're oftentimes, especially in the evangelical, like Southern, like where I came from in Christianity, is this sort of meshing of all of the stories together to try to make it into one cohesive story. And so that you don't, and it feels almost almost maniacal in a way, to make you not question, to make you not completely understand that even in that time, people couldn't completely agree on the details. Even between the Gospels, they do not agree on the details. They either remove some details or change the details or add completely new details. But they don't, they don't completely agree. And I think it's important to distinguish that, to understand that these were different writers and they wrote for their own reasons and purposes, and then placing them within the time itself and why they would be writing and why they would be writing to the audience they would be writing to. They weren't writing to us. There's no way you can argue that they were writing these and then thinking, JMD, 2,000 years from now is going to be reading this, and we want him to, take all of our stories together and combine them as one big story and a grand thing, and believe it wholeheartedly, wrapping his whole life around it. I mean, that wasn't the case. And these works were compiled together, chosen by man to compile together as well. The Bible itself was compiled in many different versions. Some having some books, some having other books, deleting books along the way, adding books along the way. So I mean, you just got to understand the nuances and break each one of them down and individually and get the understanding of which one is what each one is talking about, and that they are describing even Jesus, this grand story, in a different way, for a different purpose, for a different audience, and understanding those differences. And then if you want to, concoct a version or whatever, like you want to reason between it in your own way to find the story that you feel comfortable with believing or whatever, that's fine. But for me, that's the problem with modern preachers and the way that this stuff is oftentimes brought and taught to even young audiences, that there aren't nuances, that it's all one story and it should all be thought of as one story, and it's all like, and God, wrote it. It's his word, so he wrote it, and you have to accept all of it as truth, even when it doesn't make sense, even when they contradict each other. It doesn't make sense. Even when one is telling you one thing and one is telling you a whole different thing, and they don't line up. One is telling you that he went to this place, and one is telling you that he went to this place, and the time doesn't add up. It doesn't matter. It works itself out in some kind of way. That doesn't. None of that stuff matters. But it kind of does when you think about it. And yeah, that's pretty much what I think. In my opinion, I do believe there was a man, but to the degree of Jesus, the actual person, historical person, I think he was just a man, like any other man, that was a man of his time, that thought, that was taught and thought that, God or something of power was going to come and create an army or whatever to free the Jewish people from the Roman power, and they would finally have their, own temple and control of themselves, and it would usher in a new kingdom, which would be the kingdom of Israel, meaning a physical, actual kingdom of Israel, not some heavenly kingdom. And I think that, that's just it. I think he caused trouble amongst the Jewish elites, amongst the Roman elites, and that created this need by both to get rid of him. And so they did. Point blank. But to the anything after that, the Christ-like additions and creation of this more bigger planned movement, divine, person, or, all that, I think that was all created after the fact, and was not, in my opinion, reflective of the actual person. Don't even think that he would even agree with it or would have wanted it to happen, honestly. So anyway, thank you very much for joining me. I told you this was going to be a long video. I'm sorry. But thank you for joining me. And I will now have to figure out what's the next one in this religious series. What else I want to talk about? Maybe early Christianity. That might be where I go. Just sort of continuing on that idea of, the early Christian movement, Gnostics, what was considered heretical and how the Bible, who knows? We'll go somewhere there. Thank you very much for joining me. Until next time, peace, clear talk. I'm out.